The wooden church bell tolled 11 times that Sunday morning in 1797, each note hanging in the humid Carolina air like a death knell. This is the story of how one enslaved woman turned a master's prayer into his last confession, using nothing more than a kitchen knife and centuries of accumulated rage. Margaret stood motionless in the shadows of the makeshift chapel, her calloused fingers wrapped around the bone handle of a butcher's blade. The same hands that had prepared countless meals for the Harrington family now held the instrument of their patriarch's judgment. Pine smoke drifted from the altar candles, while the scent of tobacco leaf clung to wooden pews carved from trees that had watched this land's transformation from wilderness to bondage. The rough-hewn floorboards creaked beneath bare feet as 23 enslaved souls knelt in forced reverence. Master Thomas Harrington raised his arms toward heaven, his voice booming through the cramped space built behind his plantation house. "Lord, we thank thee for thy divine order," he proclaimed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "We thank thee for placing each soul in their rightful station." The irony dripped heavier than the candle wax pooling on pine altars. This was the same man who had torn Margaret from her children just 3 nights prior, selling her twin boys to a Charleston rice plantation to settle a gambling debt. Behind him, Margaret moved with the silence of accumulated grief. She had learned to walk without sound during her 15 years of bondage, perfecting the art of invisible presence. Her bare feet found the gaps between creaking boards with practiced precision. The congregation kept their heads bowed, but peripheral vision caught the shadow advancing toward their tormentor. None moved to warn him. What would you have done? Witnessing justice disguised as murder. From the Journal of Dr. Samuel Webb, August 15, 1797. Attended the Harrington residence this morning. Found Thomas deceased from severe throat laceration. The Negro woman Margaret apprehended at scene. Peculiar calmness noted in her demeanor. "We thank thee, O Lord," Harrington continued, his voice rising with manufactured piety, "for the burden of civilizing these heathen souls." The words choked in his throat as steel found flesh. Margaret drew the blade across his neck with the same steady motion she used to dress chickens, opening him from ear to ear. Blood sprayed across the wooden cross mounted behind the altar, painting it crimson in a baptism no preacher had intended. Harrington tried to complete his prayer even as his lifeblood poured onto pine floorboards. His mouth moved wordlessly, hands clutching his throat, eyes wide with the shock of mortality meeting manufactured divinity. The congregation erupted in screams, but Margaret never moved from her position behind the toppling body. She stood there, like a statue carved from retribution, the bloody knife hanging loose in her grip, watching her tormentor discover what lay beyond his carefully constructed theology. The aftermath painted itself in screams and scattering bodies, but one detail haunted every witness account. Margaret never ran. 23 pairs of eyes watched Thomas Harrington bleed out on consecrated ground, yet not one voice cried for help. The conspiracy of silence that followed Margaret's blade reveals how deeply her grievances ran through the entire enslaved community at Harrington's tobacco plantation. Sarah, the house cook who had trained Margaret in kitchen duties, later testified that she saw nothing unusual during the service. Joshua, who tended the plantation's horses and had been forced to help load Margaret's sons onto the Charleston-bound wagon, claimed he was praying with eyes closed when the killing occurred. Even young Bethany, barely 14 and tasked with mending the master's clothes, swore under oath that she heard only the Lord's word being spoken until the screaming began. The coordinated amnesia stretched credibility beyond breaking. Wake County Sheriff William Morrison arrived at the plantation by noon, finding a crime scene scrubbed cleaner than Sunday dishes. The blood had been mopped from the floorboards with lye soap so strong it left white patches in the wood grain. The murder weapon had been washed and returned to the kitchen knife block, its blade gleaming innocently among vegetable choppers and carving implements. Even the altar cross bore no trace of the crimson baptism witnesses described. Margaret sat in the root cellar that served as the plantation's makeshift jail, her hands folded in her lap with the same composure she'd shown during the killing. When Sheriff Morrison questioned her, she offered neither confession nor denial, responding only with steady eye contact that unnerved even seasoned lawmen. Her silence held the weight of 15 years' worth of swallowed words. From the Wake County Court records, August 16, 1797, defendant refuses counsel, speaks only to request that her sons be returned from Charleston before judgment. Court notes unusual calm in accused. The plantation's other enslaved workers maintained their conspiracy through 3 days of intensive questioning. They had learned survival through selective blindness, understanding that witnessing certain truths carried fatal consequences. But their protection of Margaret revealed something deeper than mere self-preservation. In their careful amnesia lay recognition of justified vengeance, an acknowledgement that some debts could only be paid in blood. Sheriff Morrison's frustration grew with each fruitless interview. How could 23 people witness a brutal murder yet remember nothing? The answer lay in a truth no white authority wanted to examine. Margaret had not acted alone in spirit, even if her hand held the knife solo. Her rage belonged to every mother who had watched children sold, every woman who had endured night visits from masters, every soul who had been forced to thank God for their own enslavement. Some silences speak louder than screams. The investigation stalled against this wall of collective forgetting, but Margaret's fate was never truly in doubt. A dead white man required justice, even if that justice ignored every injustice that had preceded it. The only question remaining was how quickly the wheels of retribution would turn, and whether Margaret's sons would see their mother again before the final judgment fell. What the authorities didn't know was that Margaret had planned for this moment far longer than anyone suspected. Margaret's composure in the root cellar masked 15 years of careful observation, during which she had discovered Thomas Harrington's most damning secrets. The truth about what drove her to violence lay hidden in a leather-bound ledger that would never see the light of a courtroom. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in Harrington's study, Margaret had found detailed records of his midnight visits to the quarters. The ledger documented not just his sexual assaults, but his systematic breeding program designed to increase his human property through forced conception. Names, dates, and clinical observations filled page after page, written in the same meticulous handwriting he used for tobacco sales records. Sarah had birthed 3 children by him. Bethany's pregnancy at 14 bore his signature timing. Even Margaret's own twin boys carried his features, a resemblance that had sealed their fate when his wife began asking uncomfortable questions. The ledger revealed why Harrington had sold Margaret's children so suddenly. His wife, Catherine, had begun to notice the proliferation of light-skinned babies among the enslaved population. Her growing suspicions threatened to expose not just his sexual predations, but the elaborate financial scheme built upon them. Each child he sired increased his wealth by approximately $300, making rape a calculated investment in human capital. Margaret had memorized every entry during her cleaning duties in his study. She understood that her son's sale to Charleston represented more than cruelty, it was evidence destruction. Dead witnesses could never testify to their parentage, and distance served the same purpose as death. The profits from their sale would fund another gambling expedition to Wilmington, where Harrington planned to celebrate his wife's newfound ignorance. The blade speaks what courts never would. From a letter discovered in Harrington's effects, dated August 10, 1797, "My dear Charles, the Charleston buyers paid premium rates for the boys. Their breeding potential should prove profitable in the rice country. C. grows less suspicious daily." But Margaret had taken one additional precaution that authorities would never discover. 3 nights before the killing, she had created copies of the most incriminating ledger pages, using charcoal and brown paper torn from supply sacks. These documents, hidden in the false bottom of her sleeping pallet, contained enough evidence to destroy not just Harrington's reputation, but those of the Charleston buyers who knowingly purchased his offspring. Sheriff Morrison's investigation focused exclusively on the murder weapon and witness testimonies, never examining the deeper motivations that had driven Margaret to such desperate action. The legal system's blindness to sexual violence against enslaved women meant that Harrington's crimes would die with him, buried beneath the singular focus on his killing. This willful ignorance suited everyone in power. Perfectly examining Margaret's motives too closely would expose an entire economy built upon such exploitation. The enslaved community understood what the authorities refused to acknowledge. Margaret had not simply killed a master. She had eliminated a predator whose crimes were legally invisible. Her silence during questioning protected not just herself, but every woman who had suffered Harrington's nocturnal visits, every child who bore his unwanted features, every family torn apart by his calculated breeding program. Yet even with the evidence Margaret had gathered, justice remained an impossible dream. The very laws that failed to recognize her humanity could never acknowledge her right to defend it. The ledger would burn with the rest of Harrington's papers, taking its secrets to ashes while Margaret faced judgment for the only crime the system chose to see. What Margaret didn't know was that someone else had also discovered the hidden ledger, and their knowledge would determine whether she faced the gallows or found an unexpected path to freedom. Catherine Harrington discovered her husband's ledger 2 days after Margaret slit his throat, and the revelation shattered more than her marriage. It threatened to expose the moral bankruptcy of an entire community. The widow's decision about what to do with this evidence would determine not just Margaret's fate, but the future of every enslaved soul on the plantation. Catherine had been searching Thomas's study for financial records when her fingers found the loose floorboard. The leather-bound journal beneath contained horrors she had suspected but never dared confirm. Page after page documented her husband's systematic violations, written with the clinical detachment of a livestock breeder recording successful matings. The dates aligned perfectly with her own pregnancies, revealing how Thomas had used her confinements as opportunities to assault the women in the quarters. The widow's hands shook as she read entries describing children she had watched grow up, now revealed as her husband's offspring. Little Samuel, who helped in the garden, bore Thomas's distinctive cleft chin. Maria's daughter had his green eyes. Even the twins Thomas had sold to Charleston, the very boys whose sale had triggered Margaret's murderous rage, carried detailed paternity confirmations in his meticulous handwriting. Reverend Jonathan Mills arrived at the plantation that evening to counsel the grieving widow, finding Catherine in a state that transcended ordinary bereavement. She thrust the ledger into his hands without explanation, watching his face drain of color as he absorbed its contents. Mills had presided over Thomas's funeral just hours earlier, delivering a eulogy that praised the deceased's Christian character and devotion to moral order. From Reverend Mills's personal diary, August 18, 1797, "The Lord tests us in ways that challenge our earthly understanding. I have discovered evidence that transforms murder into divine justice. Yet speaking this truth would destroy more lives than it would save." Mills faced an impossible choice. The ledger provided clear motivation for Margaret's actions, evidence that might save her from the gallows by revealing the depths of Thomas's crimes. But exposing these truths would destroy every family touched by Harrington's predations. The children he had fathered would bear the stigma of their parentage forever. The women he had assaulted would face public shame for violations they could not prevent. The entire social order depended upon maintaining certain silences. Catherine's decision came with dawn's first light. She fed the ledger to the kitchen fire page by page, watching 15 years of documented atrocities curl into smoke. Each burning sheet represented a choice to protect the living over vindicating the dead. Margaret would face judgment without the evidence that might explain her actions, but the community would be spared the scandal that would consume innocent and guilty alike. Truth burns hotter than justice. Mills watched the destruction with conflicted relief. His sermon the following Sunday would focus on forgiveness and divine mercy, never mentioning the mercy Catherine had shown by choosing silence over revelation. The congregation would never know how close they had come to learning truths that would have shattered their carefully maintained illusions about Christian civilization and moral order. Margaret, still sitting in the root cellar awaiting trial, remained unaware that her only evidence of justification had gone up in smoke. She had planned for many contingencies during her years of careful observation, but she had never anticipated that the master's widow might discover his crimes and choose to destroy rather than expose them. The trial was set for August 25th, 1897, just 10 days after the killing. Without the ledger's revelations, Margaret would face the court as nothing more than a murderous slave who had killed her Christian master during prayer. The deeper truths would remain buried with Thomas Harrington, leaving only the blood on the altar as testimony to what had truly transpired in that makeshift chapel. But Margaret had one final card to play, a secret she had never committed to any ledger, witnessed by someone whose testimony could still change everything. Young Ezra Mills, the preacher's 12-year-old son, had seen everything from his hiding place behind the chapel's woodpile, and his testimony would either damn Margaret or reveal truths that powerful men desperately wanted buried. The boy's conscience warred with his father's warnings about staying silent. Ezra had accompanied his father to the Harrington plantation that August morning, tasked with collecting hymnals from the previous week's service. While Reverend Mills spoke with Thomas about expanding the chapel, Ezra had wandered behind the building to examine a crow's nest he'd spotted in the pine trees. From his perch atop the stacked cordwood, he commanded a perfect view through the chapel's single window. The boy witnessed not just the killing, but the moments leading up to it. He saw Thomas Harrington grab Margaret's wrist as she served communion wine, pulling her close enough to whisper something that made her face go rigid with terror. He watched the master's hand slide down Margaret's body, while she stood frozen, unable to resist without causing a scene that would bring punishment to the entire congregation. Most crucially, Ezra heard the words that preceded the blade. "Your boys are already broken to harness down in Charleston," Thomas had hissed into Margaret's ear, his voice barely audible above the hymn singing. "Maybe tonight I'll start working on getting you another one to replace them." The threat had been delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who considered such violations his natural right. Ezra understood enough about plantation realities to grasp what he'd witnessed. His father's sermons often touched on the Christian duty to protect the innocent, but they never addressed what happened when the law itself enabled predators. The boy faced a moral crisis that would have challenged adults. Should he speak truth that might save Margaret's life, even if it destroyed his father's position and reputation? Children see what adults pretend to miss. From a letter between Reverend Mills and his brother, August 22, 1797, Ezra claims he witnessed provocations before the killing. "I fear his testimony would create scandal beyond repair." Yet, silence feels like complicity in whatever judgment befalls the woman. The boy's nightmares began immediately after the killing. He woke screaming about blood on crosses and masters who couldn't finish their prayers. His mother attributed the disturbances to witnessing violence, but Ezra's terror ran deeper than mere exposure to death. He had seen evil disguised as piety, watched a predator use prayer as camouflage for assault, witnessed the moment when years of accumulated violations finally erupted into lethal response. Reverend Mills recognized his son's moral torment, but felt trapped between protecting Ezra's innocence and allowing injustice to prevail. Speaking honestly about what the boy had seen would expose Thomas's crimes, but it would also thrust a 12-year-old into the center of a scandal that could destroy multiple families. The preacher's silence served his own interests as much as his son's welfare. Testifying to Thomas's assault would raise uncomfortable questions about how long such behavior had continued unchallenged. The trial approached with Ezra, carrying knowledge that could change everything. Margaret sat in her cell, unaware that salvation might come from an unexpected source. The boy's testimony could provide the context that Catherine Harrington had destroyed when she burned the ledger, revealing that Margaret's violence answered a specific and immediate threat rather than general grievance. But children who speak inconvenient truths often pay prices their protectors never anticipate. Ezra would have to choose between his own safety and Margaret's life, between family loyalty and moral courage, between the comfortable lies that preserved social order and the dangerous truths that might destroy it. The decision would haunt him long after Margaret's fate was sealed, regardless of which choice he made. The courthouse steps in. Raleigh echoed with unusual activity on the morning of August 25, 1797, as curious spectators gathered to witness what promised to be the most sensational trial in Wake County history. But inside the building, powerful men were orchestrating Margaret's fate through backroom negotiations that would never see the light of public scrutiny. Judge Cornelius Blackwood had presided over slave trials for 15 years, developing a reputation for swift justice that protected property rights above all other considerations. His docket showed Margaret's case scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning, with testimony expected from Sheriff Morrison, Reverend Mills, and selected plantation witnesses. The proceedings should have lasted no more than 2 hours before the inevitable guilty verdict and sentencing. But at 8:30, an urgent conference convened in the judge's chambers. Catherine Harrington had arrived unannounced, accompanied by her brother-in-law, Charles Harrington, who owned the largest tobacco plantation in adjacent Johnston County. Their message was simple: Margaret's trial must be concluded quickly and quietly, without the spectacle of detailed testimony that might expose uncomfortable truths about plantation management. Charles carried significant political weight in North Carolina's emerging tobacco economy. His influence extended to the governor's mansion, where his financial contributions had helped secure favorable legislation for plantation owners. When Charles Harrington suggested that a public trial might encourage dangerous ideas among the enslaved population, Judge Blackwood listened with the deference due to a man who controlled hundreds of votes and thousands of dollars in tax revenue. Power speaks louder than justice. From the Wake County Court records, August 25, 1797. Case postponed due to defendant's unexpected confession. Guilty plea entered without trial. Sentencing scheduled for immediate execution. The confession was a fabrication, but Margaret had no advocate to challenge it. She had been brought from her cell at dawn and presented with a document she could not read, told that signing it would spare her community from harsh reprisals. The lie was calculated and effective. Margaret believed her signature would protect the other enslaved people from collective punishment, unaware that she was actually confessing to premeditated murder. Young Ezra Mills waited in the courthouse hallway, prepared to testify about what he had witnessed behind the chapel. His father paced nervously, knowing the boy's testimony could expose truths that would destroy multiple reputations. When word came that Margaret had confessed and no witnesses would be needed, Reverend Mills felt both relief and shame in equal measure. The speed of the proceedings shocked even seasoned court observers. Within 30 minutes of the scheduled trial time, Margaret had been sentenced to death by hanging, with execution set for sunset that same day. The haste served multiple purposes. It prevented any awkward questions about motives, eliminated the risk of testimony that might reveal Thomas Harrington's crimes, and demonstrated to the enslaved community that resistance would be met with swift retribution. But Margaret's story was far from over. The authorities had underestimated both her resourcefulness and the loyalty she had inspired among people who understood that her violence had answered deeper injustices. As she was led back to her cell to await execution, plans were already forming in quarters where whispered conversations carried more weight than legal proceedings. The execution scaffold was built that afternoon in the courthouse square, its construction drawing crowds who expected to witness justice served. What they would actually see would challenge their assumptions about guilt, innocence, and the true nature of the crimes that had stained their community. Margaret had one final surprise for those who thought her story would end with a rope. The execution scaffold stood empty, as darkness fell over Raleigh on August 25, 1797, leaving behind only broken rope and unanswered questions that would haunt the town for generations. Margaret's disappearance from a locked cell guarded by armed men became the most inexplicable event in Wake County's recorded history. Sheriff Morrison discovered the empty cell at 5:30 that evening, just 30 minutes before the scheduled hanging. The iron bars remained intact, the lock showed no signs of tampering, and the single window was too small for human passage. Margaret had simply vanished, leaving behind only her prison dress folded neatly on the straw pallet. The guards stationed outside swore they had heard nothing unusual, seen no visitors, noticed no disturbances throughout the day. The search began immediately, with mounted posses spreading across the countryside in ever-widening circles. Dogs tracked Margaret's scent to the Neuse River, then lost it completely at the water's edge. Bloodhounds circled the riverbank in confusion, whimpering as if some unnatural force had severed the trail they were following. The river itself showed no signs of crossing, no disturbed mud, no wet footprints, no evidence of passage to the opposite shore. Judge Blackwood ordered the investigation expanded to include every farm, mill, and trading post within 50 miles of Raleigh. The reward for Margaret's capture climbed to $100, more money than most families saw in 2 years. Handbills bearing her description appeared in every settlement, from the coast to the mountains, describing a woman of average height with distinctive scarring on her left hand from childhood burns. But the searchers were looking for someone who no longer existed. From the diary of Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, August 27, 1797. Examined the cell where the Negro woman vanished. Found traces of ash and herbs I cannot identify. The stones themselves seem altered, as if exposed to intense heat, though no fire was reported. The enslaved community maintained their practiced silence, but their behavior betrayed knowledge they refused to share. They worked with unusual energy, sang with voices that carried further than usual, gathered in larger groups for evening prayers. Their eyes held secrets that no interrogation could extract, and their solidarity remained impenetrable despite offers of freedom for information about Margaret's whereabouts. 3 days after the disappearance, strange reports began filtering in from across the region. A woman matching Margaret's description had been seen walking the old Cherokee trails, moving with purpose through wilderness that would challenge experienced hunters. She appeared at dawn near trading posts, vanished by noon from crossroads settlements, left no tracks despite being spotted by multiple witnesses in locations separated by impossible distances. The sightings shared peculiar consistencies. Every witness described the same calm expression, the same measured pace, the same lack of fear, despite massive manhunts converging on the area. Most unsettling, several observers noted that Margaret cast no shadow, despite bright sunlight, and that birds fell silent in her presence before resuming their songs after she passed. Shadows hold their own truth. Local Cherokee, questioned through interpreters, claimed no knowledge of any escaped slave, but spoke in hushed tones about ancient spirits that sometimes claimed those who had suffered greatly. Their words carried weight that made even skeptical lawmen uncomfortable. Something had changed in the spiritual landscape around Raleigh, something that transcended normal understanding of escape and pursuit. The official investigation concluded after 6 weeks with no arrests, no confirmed sightings, and no explanation for how Margaret had vanished from a secured cell. Sheriff Morrison's final report attributed the escape to unknown accomplices and possible corruption among jail personnel, but privately he wondered if they were hunting something that operated beyond conventional laws. Margaret had promised justice, and justice had many forms beyond courtroom verdicts and gallows rope. Margaret's ghost still walks the streets of Raleigh on nights when church bells toll at midnight, carrying the same blade that silenced Thomas Harrington's prayers and seeking others who use piety to mask predation. Her legend grew stronger with each passing decade, transforming from local whisper to enduring warning about the price of unchecked power. The first confirmed sighting occurred exactly 1 year after her disappearance. Reverend Jonathan Mills was conducting late evening prayers at the newly constructed Methodist church when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Candle flames bent toward the altar despite no wind, and shadows moved independently of their sources. Mills turned to find Margaret standing in the back pew, her scarred hand resting on the hymnal rack, her eyes fixed on his with unmistakable recognition. She spoke only once, her voice carrying the weight of judgment deferred but not forgotten. Some prayers deserve no answer. Then she vanished, leaving behind the scent of burning herbs and a single drop of blood on the open Bible. Mills never conducted another service without checking the back pews first, and his sermons took on a different tone, less about divine order, more about earthly justice. The sightings followed patterns that revealed Margaret's continuing mission. She appeared most often in churches where powerful men gathered to pray publicly while sinning privately. Judge Blackwood reported seeing her during his final trial before retirement, standing behind the defendant's chair as he sentenced another enslaved person to death. The next morning, Blackwood was found dead in his study, his throat opened by what coroners described as an impossibly precise cut. By 1825, Margaret's legend had spread beyond Wake County. Plantation owners from Virginia to Georgia whispered her name as warning and ward against treating their human property with excessive cruelty. Some masters genuinely reformed their behavior, terrified that justice delayed might manifest as midnight visitation. Others hired guards to watch their bedrooms, installed extra locks on their doors, and slept with loaded pistols beneath their pillows. The living learn what the dead remember. From the private journal of Catherine Harrington Mills, 1832, remarried, though I swore I never would. But Jonathan understands about guilt and ghosts. We never speak of Margaret directly, but her presence shapes every prayer we offer, every mercy we show our people. Local historians attempted to document Margaret's story throughout the 19th century, but their research always hit the same obstacle: missing records. Court documents disappeared from archives, church registers lost crucial pages, and eyewitness accounts vanished from family papers. The deliberate erasure suggested ongoing efforts to bury truths that Margaret's legend kept resurrecting. Yet the story persisted through oral tradition in the Black community, passing from grandmothers to grandchildren with details that never varied. They knew Margaret's real name, Aduni, meaning sweet to have in Yoruba. They preserved the songs she had sung while cooking, the herbs she had used for healing before she turned them to killing, the African words she whispered during prayers that weren't meant for Christian gods. Modern Raleigh has grown around Margaret's legend, but developers still avoid certain plots of land where her sightings cluster most heavily. The original Harrington Plantation site remains undeveloped despite prime location, after 3 separate construction projects failed when workers reported tools moving by themselves and heard voices singing African lullabies from empty foundations. Contemporary paranormal investigators document electromagnetic disturbances around churches built on former plantation grounds, recording temperature drops and unexplained audio phenomena that match historical descriptions of Margaret's appearances. These scientific approaches miss the deeper truth: Margaret's ghost serves as collective memory for injustices that official history tried to erase. The legend endures because it answers needs that legal justice could never address. Margaret represents every enslaved woman who suffered in silence, every mother whose children were stolen, every victim whose pain was legally invisible. Her continuing presence suggests that some wounds transcend death, that some accounts remain open long after earthly courts close their books. On quiet Sunday mornings in Raleigh, when church bells echo across the city that grew from swampland and suffering, old-timers still listen for footsteps that cast no shadow, and watch for a woman who carries justice in scarred hands, that remember the weight of kitchen knives and the warmth of stolen children's embraces. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.